Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you love uncovering the hidden, haunting chapters of American history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story from the past that refuses to stay buried. Now let us begin. The Appalachians have always been a place of silence and shadow. Mountains rising like black teeth, valleys that never seem to give up their secrets, cabins rotting into the soil, and stories passed down in whispers around the fire. Folks say the land holds on to memory. What happens there, good or evil, never really dies. The wind carries it, the soil drinks it. And sometimes, the land itself seems to remember in the early half of the 1800s. Before the Civil War split the nation, the Appalachians were not just a home to poor farmers and wandering settlers. Hidden in those rugged hollows were plantations, though smaller than the wide fields of Virginia or South Carolina. Landowners carved out steep plots where tobacco and corn clung to the hills. And on those lonely holdings, enslaved men and women were made to work the soil. The mountains did not spare them the cruelty found on the lowland fields. If anything, the isolation made it worse. This story begins with one such plantation, a place already cursed before anyone spoke of cannibals. It was owned by a man named William Harp, a name that should sound familiar to anyone who knows the darker chapters of frontier history. He was not one of the infamous Harp brothers themselves, the murderers who spilled blood along the Kentucky and Tennessee frontier, but he was kin to them, a cousin who carried the same shadow in his veins. Folks whispered that wickedness ran in the Harp family like a birthmark. William's land lay in a narrow valley where the sun barely touched in winter. His cabin was built of heavy logs, his barns lean and broken. But what he prized most was not the land itself, it was the people he owned. He had 6 in all, torn from Virginia and sold into those mountains. Their names were Thomas, Ruth, Isaac, Martha, Daniel, and little Samuel, no older than 10 when he was brought there. They were not kin by blood, but by the chains that bound them. And soon enough, by something far stronger. Life under William was harsher than under most. He was a man who drank himself to madness, who beat not just his slaves, but his own sons. His wife was said to have wasted away not from sickness, but from sorrow. There were nights when travelers passing his valley claimed they heard screams, carrying through the trees. And while many plantations left some small kindness songs in the fields, but the comfort of church or a neighbor who showed pity, William gave none. He treated his enslaved people worse than cattle. He starved them. He locked them in a shed when they could not work. He marked them with fire when they angered him. Yet in those dark nights, inside that shed, a bond formed between the enslaved. They whispered to one another of escape, of justice, of a world where the whip could never reach. They prayed quietly, though William forbade it. They sang in hushed tones when the moon was high. They shared their scraps of food, slowly, through hunger and pain. They became more than just 6 souls suffering together. They became a family, but family cannot quiet the hunger in the belly. And William, in his cruelty, made hunger a constant companion. He kept his enslaved people on the edge of starvation, believing it kept them weak and obedient. The corn he grew he sold, the meat he hunted he ate for himself. What scraps they received were barely enough to keep them alive. Bones of old hogs, moldy bread, roots dug from the ground. Children's bellies swelled from want. It is said that desperate hunger can drive a man to do things he never dreamed. It breaks down the wall between man and beast. And in that valley, with winter closing in 1 year, the hunger grew so sharp it cut like a knife. The story that has been told, handed down, half whispered, half warned is that the first act of blood was not planned. One bitter January, when snow lay deep and the cabin was locked against the storm, William raged in his drink. He struck Ruth across the head with the butt of his rifle and left her crumpled, near dead. He dragged her to the shed and left her there in the dark with the others, thinking she would die by morning. But morning came, and Ruth was still breathing. Weak, broken, she whispered only one word to her companions: "Live." The others knew what she meant. There was no food, no hope. Only her broken body, slipping into death. Some say it was Thomas, her closest friend, who made the choice. Some say it was Isaac, driven mad with hunger. Whoever it was, a knife was taken, a prayer was spoken. And when Ruth passed, they did what human mouths are not meant to do. The old tales say they wept while they did it, that they prayed for forgiveness even as the blood warmed their hands, that they swore it would be only once, only for survival. But once a line is crossed, it is hard to return. The taste of human meat filled their stomachs with strength they had not known in months. The hunger eased, and in its place grew something darker. When William noticed Ruth was gone, he laughed. One less mouth to feed, he said. He never asked where her body went. He never looked close enough to see the new fire in the eyes of the people he had tormented for years. The shed was no longer just a prison. It became a place of oath and secret. Inside its walls, the family swore that one day they would be free. Not just free of chains, but free of William. They whispered of revenge, not a quick killing, but something that would make the land itself remember what he had done. From that winter on, the stories change. Travelers spoke of a strange air in that valley, a silence heavier than snow. Some claimed they saw shadows moving in the trees, though no one walked there. Some swore they smelled smoke at night, and something fouler beneath it. The Harp Valley was no longer just a place of cruelty. It was becoming something else. Something that would pass into legend, a story carried through Appalachia even after the Civil War was over. Folks began to speak of a cannibal clan. Slaves who had taken their master's evil and turned it back upon him in the most terrible way. But the first winter was only the beginning. What came after would turn whispers into screams, and screams into stories too dark to forget. The snow that year did not melt until late March. The valley stayed white and silent, the air so thin and cold it cut the lungs. William Harp grew meaner in that season, drinking more, beating harder, cursing the land for its failure to yield. But his enslaved family, those 5 left alive, walked with a strange new strength. Their eyes held fire again. Their arms did not shake so much when they lifted the tools. William saw this and thought nothing of it. To him, strength in his slaves only meant more work wrung from their backs. He never guessed what it truly meant. Inside the shed at night, where the fire was never allowed but the cold pressed like iron, Thomas whispered to the others. His voice was rough, broken from years of shouting over wind in the fields. But now it carried the weight of something different. "We ain't his cattle," he said. "We ain't his dogs. He made us into beasts, but beasts can bite." Martha, whose arms still bore the scars of William's iron, nodded in the dark. "The Lord ain't answered us," she said. "Maybe he waits for us to answer ourselves." Said nothing. His face stayed in shadow, his hands tight. But little Samuel, who had grown thinner than a fence rail, whispered back, "We gonna be free?" Thomas laid his hand on the boy's shoulder. "We gonna be free. But freedom's got a price. You hear me, child? We already paid some of it." And so it began not just survival, but plotting. Hunger had opened the door to something else, something that had been planted in them by years of cruelty. It was not just hunger of the belly now, but hunger of the soul, hunger for justice. The first time they turned their hunger outward, it was not William they struck. It was a traveler. Spring thaw brought wanderers into the valley, peddlers carrying tin and cloth, hunters chasing game, sometimes men on horseback looking for land. One evening, a man came to the Harp cabin, asking for shelter from the storm. Rolling down the ridge, William, drunk and sour, waved him to the shed instead. "They'll share a corner," he laughed, tossing the stranger to his slaves like scraps to a dog. The man never came out again. By morning, William asked no questions. Strangers went missing in the mountains all the time. He was glad enough to be rid of a freeloader. But in the shed, the family had crossed another line. The meat had been fresh, the taste rich with life. They wept again as they had with Ruth, but the weeping faded faster this time. They told themselves it was God's will that the Lord had sent the man to them as manna in the wilderness. What mattered more than the flesh was the feeling that came after. They were no longer helpless cattle. They had taken what they needed, taken life back into their own hands. And the taste of that? Power was stronger than hunger. Over the months that followed, the valley grew quiet. A hunter vanished near the ridge. A trapper never returned to town. Neighbors whispered of wolves, of bears, of the dangers that always stalked those woods. None guessed the truth that in that dark shed, by firelight, hidden from all eyes, family of the enslaved were sharpening their teeth for something far greater. But William began to notice strange things. His slaves, once weak and broken, now carried themselves with a steadiness he could not explain. Their eyes no longer dropped when he spoke. Their backs straightened. They still worked, still obeyed his whip, but something had changed. One evening, drunk on whiskey and suspicion, William stormed into the shed. He found them sitting together, their faces lit only by a crack of moon through the wall. His rage spilled out. He accused them of theft, of sloth, of plotting. He beat Isaac until the man bled, cursed Thomas until his throat grew hoarse, and dragged Martha into the yard by her hair. That night, when he finally stumbled back to his cabin, the family huddled together and whispered what could no longer be denied. "He'll kill us, one by one," Martha said through her tears. "He already killed Ruth. He'll do the same again." "No," Thomas said. His voice was iron. "Not him. Not anymore. His blood first." The others looked at him in silence. Samuel's eyes were wide, the fear of a child staring into something too large to grasp. But Isaac, battered and bleeding, lifted his head. "Then we make a plan," he said. And so they did. The plan did not come quick. It took weeks, whispered in the dark, eyes darting to the cracks in the wall. They spoke of knives, of fire, of poison. None seemed enough. William was strong when sober, vicious when drunk, and armed always. To strike him outright was to risk death for all of them. But hunger had taught them patience. Hunger had taught them how to take what they needed in silence. And so their plan was patient. They waited for William to drink himself blind, to fall heavy in his chair by the fire. They waited for the dogs to be away, for the sons to be gone on errands. They waited for the right night, when the moon was low and the valley hushed. When it came, the story says, they struck not with rage, but with cold precision. Thomas led them into the cabin. Isaac carried the axe, Martha the rope, Daniel a knife. Little Samuel was left to keep watch at the door, though his small hands shook. William never woke. His head was split before his eyes could open. His throat was cut before he could cry. They bound him, butchered him, and burned the remains in the fire he had once kept only for himself. Some say they ate that flesh too, making his cruelty part of their very bodies. Others say they fed it to the hogs, letting beasts carry away. The truth is lost, but the horror remained. What matters is what came after. For the first time in their lives, they were free of William Harp. The whip was gone. The lash was gone. But freedom did not taste the way they had dreamed. It was bitter. It was soaked in blood. And it came with a new fear. What if the neighbors found out? What if the sons returned? What if the law came hunting? They could not. Leave the valley? Not yet. Too many questions would follow. So they stayed, keeping the land as if nothing had changed. The Harp sons returned to find their father gone to drink somewhere in the mountains, or so the slaves told them. They accepted it. After all, he had vanished for days before, only to stumble home reeking of whiskey. Weeks passed, months. The truth buried itself under silence. But silence cannot hold forever. The family secret gnawed at them as surely as hunger once had. They had killed a man more than one, if the stories were true. They had tasted flesh, taken life into themselves. And with each season, the line between survival and vengeance blurred until they could not see it at all. The valley grew darker. With each passing year, travelers continued to vanish. Some said the Harp place was cursed, that the land itself swallowed men whole. Few dared to pass through after dark, and those who did told tales of shadows moving at the tree line, of eyes gleaming like beasts in the night. By then, the whispers had begun. Folks in nearby towns spoke of a cannibal clan hidden in the mountains, slaves who had turned savage, feeding on those who crossed their path. No one knew the truth. No one knew the pain and the hunger and the years of cruelty that had brought them to this. They only knew the fear. And fear has a way of growing, of spreading like fire through dry grass. The Harp Valley was no longer just a farm. It was a place of legend, a story parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far. A place where the air felt heavier, where the trees seemed to lean close, where the soil remembered too much, and deep in that valley, the family, who had once been enslaved, who had once prayed only for freedom, now found themselves bound to something far darker. They were free of William. But they were not free of what they had done. The Cannibal Clan of Appalachia had been born. The years after William Harp's death were the strangest the valley had ever known. The man's sons drifted in and out, never staying long. They were no better than their father, drunkards, fighters, wanderers. Each time they returned, they asked fewer questions about their father's absence. Perhaps they believed he had drunk himself into a ditch somewhere in the endless ridges. Perhaps they feared knowing the truth. Whatever the reason, they left the valley in the hands of those they had once called slaves to the outside world. It seemed almost ordinary. A handful of black laborers keeping up the farm, tending the soil, mending the fences. Neighbors nodded. When they passed, though none came too close, the Harp name still carried a stink, and most were glad to leave that hollow alone. But inside the valley, the air grew heavier by the year. Thomas became the unspoken leader, his back straight, his eyes colder than before. Isaac, who had once wept when he prayed, now spoke less and less, as if words could no longer carry the weight inside him. Martha's hands, scarred from the lash, turned steady with the knife. Daniel, quiet and sharp-eyed, became a watcher, always standing at the edge of the fields, scanning the woods as though expecting danger. And Samuel, no longer a child, but not yet a man, grew up in the middle of it, all born into a life where the line between survival and horror had long since been erased. It might have ended there. They might have lived out their years in that valley, haunted by their secret, keeping to themselves. But hunger and fear have a way of driving people further than they ever meant to go. The land was hard. Crops failed as often as they grew. Game thinned in the hills. Winter always came sharp, with less food than they needed. And each time the hunger rose, the old answer whispered again, "There is meat walking on two legs, meat that strays into the valley, meat that no one will miss." At first, they chose carefully, drifters, peddlers, a trapper foolish enough to pass. too close to the shed. They lured them in with promises of shelter, of warmth by the fire, of safety on the long mountain road. Then, in the dead of night, the knives came out. By dawn, nothing was left but silence. The first time they burned. A body the smell carried far. Neighbors wondered at the acrid smoke. After that, they buried the remains in shallow graves or fed them to the hogs. Some they scattered deep in the woods, bones hidden under leaves and snow. The land itself became their accomplice, swallowing what they could not hide. But no matter how careful they were, whispers grew. A peddler never made it home. A hunter's dog returned without its master. A preacher traveling between towns vanished on the ridge. Each disappearance might have been explained by wolves, by falls, by the thousand dangers of the frontier. But together they drew unease. Folks began to speak of the Harp, hollow with fresh dread. "Don't go down there," old men warned. "The land's cursed. They say the slaves turned wild." Others whispered, "Say they took to the flesh of men." The word cannibal crept into the talk like smoke. No one knew if it was true. No one dared go close enough to find out. But fear does not need proof. It only needs a story, and so the story spread. Children whispered it by firelight, daring one another to walk to the edge of the Harp place after. Dark travelers gave the hollow a wide berth, even if it meant days added to their journey. Hunters swore the deer would not enter the valley, that the animals themselves sensed what had been done there. Meanwhile, inside the hollow, the family lived with the weight of what they had become. Thomas carried himself like a man possessed. He no longer spoke of freedom as a dream to come. He spoke of it as something they had carved out with blood, something they must protect at all costs. "No chains hold us now," he said, "and none ever will again." But Samuel, grown in too, his teenage years, looked at the world beyond the valley with longing. He had never known another life, never known kindness from a neighbor, never heard the hymns of a Sunday church without fear. The only world he had seen was one built on cruelty, hunger, and the taste of blood. He began to ask questions the others would not. "Are we free?" he asked Thomas once, "if we can't leave this place?" Thomas looked at him long and hard. "We're alive," he said at last. "That's more than Ruth, more than any who crossed us. Don't ask for more." But Samuel did ask. In his heart, he wondered what lay beyond the ridge downs where people laughed without fear. Farms where families worked their own soil, not another man's. He wondered if freedom might mean more than surviving in a valley that stank of smoke. And secrets. Those questions planted seeds of tension among them. Isaac grew harsher, warning the boy never to speak such things aloud. Martha hushed him with weary eyes, knowing the danger of doubt. Daniel only watched, his silence deeper than ever. Yet outside the hollow, the world was changing. The 1850s crept toward the storm of war. Rumors of abolition, of uprisings, of men fleeing north through secret lines, reached even into the mountains. Slavery itself trembled, though the tremor had not yet broken the earth. For the Harp slaves turned family, the talk of freedom for others only deepened their fear. If the war came, if soldiers marched these ridges, if neighbors spoke too closely, what would happen when their secret was uncovered? They were not just runaways. They were not just survivors. They were killers. And if the stories told about them ever proved true, no army would call them free men and women. They would be hunted like beasts, so they clung tighter to their valley, tighter to their silence, tighter to one another. But the silence could not hold forever. One autumn, when the leaves burned red and gold, two young men came riding into the hollow. They were not peddlers or wanderers. They were neighbors' sons of a family that lived 3 miles over the ridge. They had come to borrow a tool, they said, or so their families recalled. But they never returned. That was the turning point. When Two men from good families vanished so close to the Harp place, suspicion sharpened like a knife. Neighbors who had once whispered now began to speak aloud. They rode the ridges in search, called the men's names through the trees, found nothing but silence and the stench of old smoke in the valley. Eyes turned toward the family in the hollow. Questions grew. How had they survived all these years? Without William, how had they fed themselves when others went hungry? Why did no one see them in town, hear their voices in church, watch them trade at the mill? The whispers of cannibalism became louder, heavier, possible to ignore, and the family knew it. That winter, their fear grew sharper than hunger. They slept with knives at hand, with eyes on the door. The shed, where they had once huddled together, became a fortress, a place where every creak of wood might mean the neighbors were coming. Torches in hand, Thomas told them to stand ready. "We've come too far to fall now," he said. "We'll fight them like we fought him." But Samuel lay awake at night, staring at the roof beams, wondering if fighting meant only more blood, more flesh, more horror. He wondered if freedom meant dying in that valley, remembered only as monsters in the stories of others. And outside, in the snow and silence of Appalachia, the neighbors gathered their courage. They would not let their sons vanish into the earth. They would not let the hollow keep its secret forever. The reckoning was coming. The winter after the two neighbor boys disappeared was the coldest anyone remembered. The ridges were buried in snow, the creeks frozen hard, and the air itself seemed to crack when you breathed. Colder still was the fear that ran through the community that the families who lived beyond the Harp hollow no longer whispered. They spoke plain. Something evil lived in that valley. Something had taken their sons, their kin, and too many travelers before them. Wolves did not open doors. Bears did not make men vanish without a trace. No, this was human work. And so the talk turned to justice. In small cabins lit only by firelight, neighbors swore oaths. They sharpened axes, loaded rifles, hitched their horses to sleighs. They said it was not about vengeance, but about safety. About protecting their children from the hunger that had taken root in that cursed place. But beneath it all was rage, and beneath rage, fear. Word reached the hollow before the men came. Daniel, always watching, always listening, spotted riders on the ridge, heard the distant echo of shouts. He returned to the shed with his eyes dark. "As Cole, they're coming," he said simply. The family sat in silence. The fire burned low. Outside, the snow fell heavy, muffling the world. Thomas was the first to speak. "Then we meet them." His voice was hard, steady, the voice of a man who had crossed too many lines to turn back. "We take what we've taken before. We fight." Martha, weary and scarred, laid a hand on his arm. "We can't fight the whole mountain." Isaac snarled. "Better to die with blood in our mouths than to hang from their ropes." But Samuel, standing apart, shook his head. His eyes were wide, filled with something the others no longer carried hope. Or perhaps only the desperate wish for it. "If we fight," he said softly, "we become the very monsters they call us. If we die here, no one will remember we were people. They'll only remember the horror." The room fell silent. The boy's words hung in the air like frost. But Thomas turned on him, his face twisted. "We are people," he hissed. "We bled for freedom. We burned for it. We starved for it. Don't you dare forget what he did to us." Samuel's voice trembled but did not break. "I ain't forgot. But if freedom means only killing, then maybe we ain't free at all." The argument never found an end. For by dawn, the riders had come. They came in a line, torches flaring against the snow rifles slung across their backs. 20 men, maybe more, their faces grim, their eyes hard with loss. They rode into the valley like a storm, their shouts carrying through the trees. "Come out!" they roared. "Come out and answer for what you done!" The family gathered in the shed, the fire behind them casting their shadows high against the walls. Knives glinted in their hands. The smell of smoke clung to their clothes, the smoke of all they had burned before. Thomas stood at the door, his shoulders square. "If we fall," he told the others, "we fall as one." The door burst open, snow and torchlight spilled inside. For a moment, the world was nothing but shouts and fire. The crack of rifles, the clash of bodies. What happened in that hour has never been told plain. Some say Thomas cut down 3 men before he fell, his knife flashing like lightning. Some say Isaac leaped at the torches, scattering fire through the shed. Some say Martha screamed a curse that echoed through the valley long after her voice was silenced, and Samuel's fate is the most uncertain of all. Some claimed they saw him run into the woods, his thin figure swallowed by snow, never to return. Others swore he was taken, his body buried with the rest. But there were those, years later, who whispered of a wandering man with haunted eyes, a man who carried the weight of a family lost to blood. When the fire died, the shed was nothing but ash and smoke. The neighbors stood in silence, their torches guttering in the wind. The Harp Hollow was still at last, but the stillness was not peace. They had ended the clan, but they had not ended the story. In the months that followed, folks could not speak of what they had seen without lowering their voices. They did not tell the tale in full, not in church, not to their wives, not to their children, but pieces slipped out. A scream in the dark, a body torn, the smell of burned flesh, and over time, those pieces grew into legend. They called them the Cannibal Clan of Appalachia. Some said they were demons, not men. Some said they were spirits, cursed to haunt the valley forever. Others said they had been ordinary slaves, driven by cruelty into madness. But no matter how the story was told, it always ended the same, with blood, with fire, with the hollow left empty. Years passed. The Civil War came and went. Slavery ended, but the land remembered. Travelers still shunned the Harp Hollow. Children still whispered the tale at night. Hunters still swore the deer would not walk that ground. And even today, if you go deep enough into the Appalachians, you find yourself in a valley where the air feels heavy and the woods grow too quiet. You may hear the old story again. They say the soil there is richer than anywhere else, dark and thick, as if it had been fed with more than leaves and rain. They say the wind carries a smell, faint but bitter, like smoke long extinguished. They say if you listen at night, you can hear voices whispers that speak of hunger, of chains, of blood. And some say the boy Samuel lived on, carrying his family's ghost with him, never staying long in one place, his eyes hollow, his voice low. They say he told no one the full truth, but in his silence, the story spread all the same, the Cannibal Clan of Appalachia. Not just a tale of horror, but a story of what cruelty can carve into the human soul. A story of hunger and vengeance, of freedom twisted by blood. A story the mountains still hold, a warning whispered by the wind through the trees, that what is done in darkness does not die. It lives on, it feeds, it remembers.